And this is what they put forward as the image of Trump. This is the template for you to follow. Not like, oh, you're kind of like Jehu. This is what you need to do. And when that's preached in your church, when that is propagated by your prophets, how is violence not accepted then?
Right. Hey friends, how are we doing? Welcome to my home studio. I wanted to come on really quick before you listen to this conversation with Matthew Taylor and just share a personal message. I absolutely think this is the most important interview I've done perhaps all year. Matthew Taylor is such a qualified voice who really researches the people and personalities behind Christian nationalism. And now that Trump has won the election, we need to know exactly what we're in for. And so I really recommend watching this conversation in its entirety. I'm such a huge fan of Matt. He does such amazing work. His book, The Violent Take It by Force, is out now. This is not a paid promotion or anything like that. It's just a personal message from me to you to please watch this entire conversation. You will learn so much. And let me just say that we have a very important couple years ahead of us. We must organize and we must know what the threat is. And Matt is one of the people doing the hard, tedious work of exposing the leaders behind the Christian nationalist movement, what they want, what they're going after, and how they're going to do it. And once we know that, then we can better learn how to resist them. So hope you enjoy this conversation. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you're enjoying this content, leave a comment. Talk to y'all later on. Have a great holiday. See ya. That's helpful. I always wonder like how scholars get their information. I mean, I assume if you're writing a book, it's one thing. If you're just trying to consume content, you're to Google, it's your typical mainstream sources.
Right. Well, yeah. I subscribe to the Times and the Atlantic, and I use Google News to kind of keep an eye on what's going on in general. But frankly, it's just hard to stay on top of everything because I'm monitoring hundreds now of these figures, and even keeping my own head straight about who's where and what they're doing is
that's what's so interesting about you, is because I think out of all of the scholars I've had the privilege of interviewing on Christian nationalism, I see you as someone who probably knows the most about the actual people leading this stuff. Like, you seem to be the most, at least well-spoken, and the most informed on names that, like, for example, Andrew Whitehead, a great friend on the podcast often, he's looking at the sociological data. You know, he's not maybe tracking the figureheads who are kind of pushing the different strands of Christian nationalism that we're seeing. And as I think about it out loud, I'm not aware really of anyone that is. You're one of the few people where when I text you, you're like, yeah, I already know that. I covered it here. I'm like, okay. Sometimes that usually does not happen. Usually I'm the first to break it to an Andrew type, or sometimes even like Christian Dumais, right? Yeah. But when it comes to you, I have yet to surprise you through our text messages. Usually it's like, yeah, man, that was last week. Where you been? I'm like, oh, dang, like, I'm behind the times, you know?
I think you have clued me into a few things over the last couple of years. But no, I mean, some of it is I find the people interesting. Right. And I think most of the people right now, at least the first wave of scholars who were working on Christian nationalism, were sociologists. And so they were very interested.
Samuel Perry, Andrew Whitehead.
Yeah, Paul Jupe, even Robbie Jones, right? And so a lot of what they are, they're trained to analyze the numbers, trained to analyze the statistics, and to really go fine grain with that. And they have generated a lot of very interesting data from that that's very useful. My own approach, I'm coming much more from a humanities approach, and in religious studies, there really is, it's an interdisciplinary field of study, and so you have the social sciences and the humanities in there, and then of course you also have theology as this other matrix that gets introduced, and so I'm much more coming from the humanities theology side of things, and then just my own orientation is I think a lot more in terms of people than numbers, and I think leaders really, really matter. Right. And they really do set the tone in a way that I think sometimes people who have more of a sociology orientation want to understand trends and want to understand mass movement, where I think the individuals really do matter. And if you can understand where they're coming from and even the dynamics among them, because a lot of what's going wrong, a lot of what's become toxic right now in the Christian far right or Christian nationalism, Christian extremism, Christian supremacy, however we want to talk about this blob, is it's a leadership culture. And if you don't understand the incentives within that leadership culture and the dynamics and relationships and power struggles within that leadership culture, you can't understand what the people are doing.
Yeah. By the way, I did the thing again. This is Matthew Taylor, everyone, just so you know. He's a scholar of Christian nationalism. That's who's on this episode of TNE Talks in Studio. So it's good to have you, Matt, for sure. I always do this, right? I just start talking to my guests, because frankly, you and I talk offline all the time too. And for someone to be in this studio with me, I usually have some kind of relationship with them ahead of time, because it makes it so much more fun and easier. And I always forget that my audience sometimes doesn't know the person to my right. So Matt Taylor, scholar of Christian nationalism. Where do you reside? Like, where do you teach from or do your scholarship at?
So I am a senior scholar and the Protestant scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore.
Okay, got it. Were you surprised by the Trump win? I mean, for me, I'm still kind of thinking about not just the win, but how decisive it seemed to be. A lot of pundits, all of them, I mean, even Republican pundits were like, this is going to be razor thin. It's going to be so close. The polling is so close. And it turns out like it wasn't super close. I mean, Trump won the popular vote first time, I think, in 20 years. Republicans won that vote. Of course, he won the Electoral College. They took the Senate and the House. They have a Supreme Court majority. It doesn't seem like it was really that close to me. Were you shocked by that, all that, or did you kind of see that coming? Because you really do track people, like you really know names that most Americans don't know would be behind the Trump administration. And we've tried our best to kind of raise the awareness of like, look, for me, it's not so much Trump, although he's problematic. It's who he would bring into these cabinet positions or positions of power that concern me the most. So that being said, how surprised were you by a Trump win?
I think in the long scheme of things, I was not surprised. I was surprised at how definitive it was, what a wide margin he won by. And I think in the few days right before the election, I indulged in just a shred of hopium. I think watching the
that's a good word.
The Ann Seltzer poll come out of Iowa and listening to all these commentators, and I'm not a political scientist. I am not a political analyst, so I really do rely on these kind of commentators and people who are these experts, and so many of them were saying we've got this. This is trending our way. This is really like Harris seems to have locked this down. And especially in those last few days before the election, I was like, I think she is going to win this. But I was expecting just chaos, even if Harris won.
Yeah.
So I think and Trump and his people were geared up to wreak havoc if she won. Yeah. So I was expecting. I knew that this was a possibility that Trump would win it outright, and I never discounted it. And I think I always thought that was like the at least 40% chance, or at least that he would somehow end up in office seemed like a very solid probability, or at least if not possibility. And but I did right before the election. I think I really thought it looks like it's going Harris's way, and we just have to prepare for the aftermath.
Right.
And then election night, as it rolled through, I was like, pretty early on, I was like, oh no, this is 2016. This is
yes. I mean, I have a friend who's in the political world, and they were telling me, hey, this looks really strong. We're seeing some new movement that usually means that the Trump team is feeling like they're on their heels. I feel good. I'm like, okay, look, I mean, I'm not to your point, same thing. I'm not a pro. This is not my world. Great. And as I watched the election results more and more, I'm like, I don't know. And then I think I was watching whoever it was. I was watching the anchor on CNN, and they did this thing where they mentioned that according to their exit polls in Georgia, independents swung by like 20 points. And I was like, that is really not a good sign. Yes. And then I saw the other part where they said, I think it was Jake Tapper or someone said, hey, can you show me all of the counties in America where Harris has Harris has overperformed? Not one.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh no, is this 2016 all over again? I'm curious for you because you've spent so much time and so many years, and we've had you on the podcast many times talking about this. You've tracked the figures of Christian nationalism. You did a great piece with Straight White American Jesus, breaking down January 6th and the New Apostolic Reformation's complicity in that. A lot of people are still trying to make sense of how did we get here? What went wrong, right? I've heard all kinds of people with different opinions. Some people saying the Democratic establishment is to blame for a lot of this. Right-wing media is so powerful, and we underestimated how influential they were. Minorities voted more for Trump, etc. I think it's probably a combination of things, but how much do you think Christian nationalism and the white evangelical power structures played in giving Trump the presidency this time around?
It was a very important piece of the puzzle. Obviously not the whole puzzle. I mean, you have so many different factors feeding into this election, and I worry that the conventional wisdom seems to be congealing around these economic explanations.
Right.
And I think that's also a piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. People vote in their perceived economic best interest. Those are actually their economic best interests.
Right.
Fine. But and I think that's a piece of it, and we shouldn't discount that. But you also have to understand how much Trump managed to pollute the information ecosystem since he lost in 2020. I mean, he started polluting that information ecosystem in the 2016 campaign when he started saying this election is going to be rigged.
Right.
And then in the 2020 campaign when he said this election is going to be rigged. And then he activated that after he lost in 2020. And the fact is, a third of the country going into this election, the 2024 election, a third of the country believed the 2020 election was stolen.
Wow.
And if you looked among white evangelicals,
Yeah.
it was closer to 2/3.
Wow.
And so I've used the analogy before that I think if we think back in American history,
Yeah.
and go back to the Civil War, right? The tagline is the North won the war and the South won the propaganda.
Right.
Right. And so what happened after the Civil War, through Reconstruction and then the destruction of Reconstruction, was this lost cause narrative set in, this grievance, this sense that in the South, we were the victims. We were the ones who had the righteous cause, and we were devastated and destroyed by these unrighteous Northerners. And I think that the 2020 election lies have served as a miniature, a microcosm lost cause narrative that has activated a part of the country that is not intrinsically politically dialed in, is not always paying attention to politics, but who identify enough with Trump, identify enough with MAGA that it activated them, and it brought them in. It either deepened their cynicism about our politics and their distrust in our institutions, or it created a new distrust in them. And when you're coming into an election, if that's the floor of Trump's support, because if somebody believes the 2020 election was stolen, they are already bought into enough conspiracy theories and lies and unreality that there's no winning them over in the short term.
Right.
And then it just required that extra 15, 16, 17% of people who I'm sure had a variety of reasons, but you also can't discount their information ecosystem was also polluted with all of this.
Well, I think that's actually really important. It is the drum I've been banging for over a year now, maybe close to 2, where I'm looking at the right-wing media ecosystem and I'm like, wow, these folks are really well funded. They have massive audiences. They show up every day. They reinforce the narrative of whatever MAGA is saying that day. They have no problem, espousing half-truths and whole lies, right? And how do you compete with that? Because mainstream media, and this is just me opining, but I think in their quest not to come across as biased, they really did not hit just how dangerous a Trump presidency would be. They wouldn't acknowledge the fundamentalist theocrats behind the Trump administration. I mean, when Doug Wilson, for example, is going on Tucker Carlson and being promoted on X in front of millions of people, and no one in mainstream media or even left-wing spaces are talking about it, right? I go, guys, I think we're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. And frankly, I think that's for a couple of reasons. I think one, mainstream and left-wing media tend to be much more secular. I'm not sure if they even know these names, frankly. But also B, I think especially in the case of mainstream media, they don't want to come across bias. Yeah. So they really downplay, what was behind the lies that Trump told. Because you're right. One of the things that we talk about often is this idea of truth. I mean, I was brought up a white evangelical. Truth, I was taught, was so important. Like, truth matters, objective truth matters. Here's how we prove that our faith is true or the Bible is true. All the things, right? And it's just so bizarre to watch so many of those same people tell me with a straight face that the election was most likely stolen, despite all the objective evidence that would say otherwise. Everything from Dominion voting machines essentially winning their lawsuit with Fox News, even though they went to settlement, Rudy Giuliani, Trump's own lawyer, saying in court there was no election fraud, all of the cases being overturned. Despite all that data, to your point, 2/3 of white evangelicals believe, no, it was stolen. When that is the foundation for how we see reality, I just don't know where to go from there. Because I feel like we're living almost in a flat earth, round earth situation where it's like, guys, you can believe the earth is flat, but it defies every single piece of evidence that we have. It reminds me of when Candace Owens a few months ago, with a straight face, said, I'm not a flat earther, but I'm also not a round earther either. I think that science is science.
Both sides.
Yeah, and she said that. And then she said something to the effect of, I think that science is like a pagan occult religion.
If there's a bunch of people that believe something, I now want to know what it is that they believe. And of course, he pushed me on this, and he was talking about the earth curvature and science. And I said to him, listen, I'm not a flat earther. I'm not a round earther. Actually, what I am is I am somebody who has left the cult of science. I have left the mega church of science, because what I have now realized is that science, what it is actually, and think about it, is a pagan faith.
And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, guys, this is the worst way to frame this stuff. Yeah. But there's no counteracting. There's no counter. Yeah. There's no media people talking about how this is ridiculous and how we have to stand on actual data. I don't know. I don't really know if there's a question there, but that's where I'm at with this stuff.
I think the reality is, and I talk to some weeks a dozen reporters. I'm doing interviews with reporters almost every day.
Wow.
So I work with the full range of local news, national news, network news, and I'm constantly talking about these topics. And the reporters are good people. They work hard. Right. They are smart.
Right.
But they're doing their job with one hand tied behind their back.
Yeah.
And really, right now, the mainstream media in the United States is speaking to about 1/3 of the country.
Right.
And that third is urban, cosmopolitan, and suburban elites, college-educated people like us. Right. And
well, I'm not college educated, but yes.
Okay, fair enough.
I have no degree, to be clear.
I'll share some of mine.
Thank you.
But the truth is, like, that world has its own little echo chamber, and I think we saw that on visceral display in this election.
Yeah.
That and the reality is, right-wing media is also only speaking to about 1/3 of the country. Mm. And so there's this other third, this middle third, that is very detached, very cynical, very disillusioned, very downtrodden. I mean, many of them are struggling. They have family structures that are not working.
Right.
They are in many ways the underclass, right, that has been created by our oligarchic robber baron economy.
Yeah.
And that are and they are susceptible to some of the same messages that filter through right-wing media, though.
Yes.
I think they're far more accessible to right-wing influencers than they are to the mainstream media.
Yep.
And I think that was part of what Trump capitalized on at the very end of the campaign, was he managed to penetrate into these Joe Rogan and Twitch influencer kind of spaces that I think I would be surprised if many people inside the Harris campaign even knew those spaces existed, much less valued them.
Right.
But a lot of our culture is not getting their news from the news. And if you're only speaking to the news, then you will not even understand those people and they will never hear you.
I mean, unless I'm researching something or like I want to hear whatever CNN's saying, I get news stories from things that are circulated online through Twitter or through Instagram or someone goes viral on TikTok as a news anchor, but I don't like get my news from, I mean, even the New York Times, like I have all these subscriptions. I go there if I need to, but like, I'm not like, ooh, what's on the front page? I mean, I check CNN pretty much, you know, I listen to Apple News podcasts, but most of my like influx of like, oh, this is happening comes first from social media.
Yes.
And I think that, you know, I've gotten some flack for saying that I think that the Democratic establishment is partially to blame for losing the election, but I stand by it. I really do, because to your point, regardless of inflation being down, prices are still up.
Yep.
Now, I understand how that's not necessarily Joe Biden's fault necessarily. Or President Biden's fault. I get that, but the felt impact is still there. Listen, I'm a very much middle class person living in New Jersey.
Yeah.
It is not a cheap state. My groceries are expensive. I run a small nonprofit making content like this, right? So I feel that too. I get worried about where healthcare is going to come from. Yep. I get worried about how our budget's doing, or if we have a major expense, how we're going to recoup that loss. Like, I feel that pain too, and I'm someone who voted for Harris. I believe way more in her policies than in Trump's. That being said, and maybe we can kind of transition here a little bit, but you mentioned earlier before we started recording how Trump is like a populist authoritarian. Do you think that populism, first off, can you define it for us? But do you think that populism is inherently bad? Because I feel like if there was a more populist movement on the left that was advocating for the policies that we want to see, livable wages, affordable health care, paid family leave, things that we've been talking about for years, I think that could really be popular with Americans. But for some reason, those things aren't really touted by the Democrats as like, no, we're going to get this done if you get us elected. So I think, like, what about a populist leftist movement? But maybe populism is bad. I don't know. I need a scholar to explain it to me.
Well, again, I'm not a political scientist, so I'm coming at this as a religious studies theology person. And so I don't think populism is intrinsically bad, but I think populist authoritarianism is intrinsically dangerous.
Okay.
And so populist authoritarians are leaders who capitalize on the fears and anxieties of a community, of a nation, of a populace, who play into the irrational hopes that people have, play into the easy messianic fervors that we human beings can find ourselves in, and who cast themselves as the solution. Right, so populism, so populism is like, we need everyone together to try to fix these problems, and we need to make it about the people and not about the elites. Great,
yes,
fine,
sign me up. I'm in.
but then when you turn that into, and this one leader is the solution, well, then that is not real populism, right? And populism, as a rhetorical style, always relies upon elites. Right, Tucker Carlson casts himself as a populist. He is the opposite of a populist.
Elon Musk, the world's richest man.
Donald Trump, a man who lives in a golden tower, who craps in a golden toilet. Right,
I was going to say that. Yes,
the idea that man is a populist is such BS. Right. And yet that is the way that populism and especially populist authoritarianism works. And the problem that we have is these populist authoritarian movements historically, I mean, you look around the world, they can come up on the right or the left of the political spectrum, but they're always dangerous. And in fact, I would argue that in liberal democracies, which is what we aspire to, liberal with a lowercase l, right? Democracies where you have the rule of law, where you have protection for individual rights, where you have freedom of expression, where elections actually work, where there's multiple parties that are contesting for the government. Liberal democracies, the Achilles heel are these populist authoritarian movements, because they grow up within the democracy. They emerge within the democracy, and they use the tools and the mechanisms of the democracy to come to power.
Wait, are you saying that populist authoritarians are the Achilles heel?
Yes. Populist authoritarian movements are the Achilles heel
of liberal democracies.
And the American founders knew this, and they would talk about the danger of the demagogue. In fact, that was what they created the Electoral College for, was to prevent people like Donald Trump from coming to power. But the Electoral College is atrophied and does not work the way it was intended to. And we probably should get rid of it because it really is not functioning properly. But it was intended. It was intended as another check. They really thought the Electoral College would be a deliberative body that would be a kind of last dash resort if you had somebody like Trump come to power who was unconscionable. The Electoral College was supposed to stop that from coming to power. Huh. And so the challenge we have now is we've always had populist authoritarian voices in American politics. That's not new. We've never had a populist authoritarian movement take over a political party and come to power uncontested. I mean, at this point, Donald Trump and the MAGA, I mean, even in 2016, MAGA was still the outsiders.
Yep.
And they had to have this shotgun marriage with the Republican establishment. And that was what created this adults in the room dynamic that held Donald Trump in some check. I mean, it was the first Trump administration was chaotic and stupid, but it was moderated. I mean, the joke is, right, it was malevolence tempered by incompetence, but it was also tempered by the Republican establishment figures who knew the danger of Trump and wanted to curb those dangers, put some bumpers on those dangers. Today, the Republican establishment is gone. If anything, they are a whipped dog who cannot stand up to Trump. And so he's going to run roughshod. And the danger is once populist authoritarian parties and movements come to power, they truly do rig the system so that other parties can't operate or can't rival them. And they take over media and they cow the media. And they create a regime that has the veneer of a democracy. It's what we would call an illiberal democracy. It has the trappings of democracy.
Right.
You still have elections.
You can vote.
You can vote. You still have elections. There still is a Department of Justice that is ostensibly prosecuting criminals. It's just that Department of Justice will also prosecute the political enemies of Donald Trump and anyone who crosses him and his people, and will maybe prosecute the next presidential candidate who emerges from another party, maybe disqualify them because they're being prosecuted, right? I mean, all of these, there's all these levers, these knobs that a populist authoritarian can turn, and our Supreme Court has given Trump even more of those levers.
Okay,
And
two things. Number one, I would imagine people listening to this or watching who are more conservative saying, Matt, that's exactly what people did against Trump. I mean, they tried to impeach him. Jack Smith tried to bring these charges against him. They tried to kick him off the ballot. So aren't you kind of like pot calling the kettle black here where, the Biden administration tried to prosecute a political opponent? That's a big talking point. How do you respond to that? Because, I mean, there's no doubt that people did try to prosecute Trump. He's a convicted felon in New York now, because he was put on trial. So what's the difference? What's the difference between that versus what you're describing?
Even that is a populist authoritarian talking point that says, oh, see, the other side is doing it the same or worse. No, they aren't. The only way you get there is by denying reality. By denying the reality that Donald Trump attempted to overturn the last election. Donald Trump incited an insurrection against our country and let it play out for hours without intervening.
Yeah.
Donald Trump did steal documents. Donald Trump did all those crimes that he's accused of. Now, whether they are fully adjudicated as crimes or just alleged crimes, they were crimes, right? And so, but this is, again, one of the moves that these populist authoritarian movements do is they handcuff, right? Going into this election, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were going to abide by the rules.
Right.
They were going to say, we're going to wait for this process to play out. We are going to follow the will of the people. Donald Trump was not going to follow the will of the people.
Right.
If he lost this election, he was going to deny it again. And he was going to fight. And he was going to push things to another January 6th or worse. Because that's how populist authoritarians work. Is they say, I am the entitled one.
Right.
I am the divinely anointed one. I need to come to power.
Right.
Through whatever means necessary, because I am the essential person.
Right.
And so it creates this asymmetry in our politics. And this is really going on in right-wing media as well, right? Right-wing media is unabashedly right-wing. Totally happy to echo right-wing talking points, to voice lies, to blatantly disregard the truth. And mainstream media says, we need to hear both sides.
Right.
We need to acknowledge validity. And they're so hesitant to call out lies, to call out disinformation, to call out these distortions, that it allows the lie to just keep perpetuating and recycling. And they don't want to acknowledge that they aren't speaking to the whole country. They don't want to acknowledge that their power has been stripped away from them by this right-wing propaganda.
Right. It is interesting that almost overnight, the election fraud claim evaporated.
Of course.
Right? I mean, all this whole time, our elections aren't secure. They're not secure. Our elections have been stolen. They're not secure. And then once Trump was declared the winner, everything's good. Everything's fine. I mean, literally not a whiff. I remember 4 years ago, Twitter being inundated with people, fake elections here, rigged here, overnight ballots coming in, all this propaganda, right? Yep. Not an ounce of that. I have seen a few, not many, a few people on the left claiming that something feels suspicious, but most of those have been shut down by people being like, no, that's ridiculous. We have the data on this. Yep. So it is, again, to your point, how they use propaganda is just it's so evident, but it seems to work, right? Because to your point, especially among white evangelicals, 2/3 believed that the election was stolen. And for some reason, those people can't, for whatever reason, they don't think, why wasn't it stolen this time? Like, what's the common denominator? Well, Trump won. That's why Trump's not talking about the election being stolen. He doesn't actually care about a free and fair election. He cares about if he wins or not.
I mean, if you want a one-sentence definition of authoritarianism, it's that truth is subordinated to power. And that is what has happened in the MAGA movement.
Wow.
Is that truth is subordinated to power. And so at some point, if everything is about the will to power and coming to power, and this is the virus that has infected the Christian nationalist movement, this is the virus that has infected the Republican Party. If everything is about coming to power and claiming power, then the truth doesn't actually matter that much. The truth is fungible as long as you come to power. And what that creates then is, and this is how even modern totalitarian states work. In early 20th century authoritarian and totalitarian states, the goal was to control the information space. The goal was to propagate the ideology. Socialism, communism, Marxism, fascism. It was the unifying ideology that held everything together. Contemporary authoritarians, they just want you not to believe there's any truth. They want you to be so confused, so distrustful of every source of information that you say, who can even know? Who can know whether Putin won the election or not?
Right.
He says he did. He's in the office. We just have to accept it. Right, so the goal now is, as Steve Bannon famously put it, to flood the zone with shit. And I think we, coming into January 2025, can just expect a hurricane of bullshit that will swamp our media, will swamp even just our capacity to think clearly.
Yeah.
Because it'll just be chaos. It'll be madness. You won't even be able to follow the storylines, and that's part of the goal.
Well, I think about when J.D. Vance admitted on the air that they made up the Haitian immigrants eating cats and dogs story just to get media attention, right? Like they say it. He said it out loud on national television.
Yes.
And again, for some reason, it just did not seem to be a crazy enough statement to really swing voters to be like, oh, I don't think I want that guy close to the White House. If they're willing to lie about my Haitian immigrant neighbors, as someone who, like I said, is probably the most informed on the leaders of this Christian nationalist ideology, and we're going to break down the different sects that you did in that tweet that you did on. It was so good, but I mean, I don't want to sound alarmist. I always try and tell people that I'm not trying to become the Rush Limbaugh of the left, of like the sky is falling, our America is at risk. But if there's data that supports hey, we should be really worried notion, we want to be able to be realistic as well. I mean, how concerned are you seriously about the next 4 years under Trump, knowing what you know about Christian nationalism, authoritarianism, et cetera?
I don't think the United States of America has ever faced a more potent threat than a second Trump administration.
Wow.
I think it is more dangerous to us, or to the health of our democracy, even than the Civil War. Because in the Civil War, you had half or 2/3 of the country that was united around the continued vision of building a more perfect union. And then you had a rebellion against that. But even the Confederacy was espousing the values of the American founding. It was a deeply distorted, hegemonic, enslaving version, but that also had resonances with our founding, right? What we are seeing right now is the threatened total degradation of our democracy, and the hijacking of all of the iconography of Americana, all the rhetoric of American history, all of the imagery and patriotic symbolism that we have, the weaponization of that for right-wing causes. And I am very concerned. Now, I think we have to be realistic and recognize the first Trump administration was malevolence tempered by incompetence. And so Trump was remarkably ineffective because of his personality flaws. And I don't discount that. Those personality flaws are, if anything, worse today.
Right.
He's even less of a systematic and organized thinker. He's even less of he has even less of an ego or superego. He's all id now. And I think some of that is a shift that's happened since January 6th. So if we think about, and I truly think we need to stop thinking in terms of American exceptionalism and stop appealing simply to our own history for analogies for what's going on. We need to look around the world, because we are not the only democracy in the world. I'm sorry to break that news to everyone.
What?
We're not the only liberal democracy. We're not the only space that is grappling with a religious nationalist movement and an authoritarian movement. And so I think we need to look around the world and see the full range of possibilities. And so I think the best case scenario is that it's the first Trump administration revived. So lots of chaos, kleptocracy, Trump enriching himself.
What's kleptocracy?
Kleptocracy is the rule by the thieves.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, Russia is a
fox
kleptocracy.
in the hen house.
The goal of political leaders is to enrich themselves. And of this kind of oligarchic class, the Elon Musks of the world.
Yeah,
right?
no, a man of the people, Matt. A man of the people, Elon Musk. Yeah, no, definitely.
He another populist, right?
Right.
So that's the best case scenario. Trump has not gotten better, and if he persists in who he is and surrounds himself with people like himself, they're going to trip over their own shoelaces a lot. The worst case scenario is Germany 1933. I mean, Dachau concentration camp opened about 2 months after Hitler came to power in January 1933. And you already have the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, discussing hiring private firms to create detention camps at the border, concentration camps. And I don't know how Trump would be able to enact his campaign promises about deporting 11 million immigrants without concentration camps. There's just a certain fascistic logic to it. So I think we need to recognize that all of that. So that's the extreme end of the range. If we're thinking of it kind of like a bell curve in terms of probability, I would say Trump 1.0 would be the other extreme end. I don't think that we're going to get that lucky. So the middle distribution of that range is more like Viktor Orban's Hungary, or like Recep Tayyip Erdogan's Turkey, or like Narendra Modi's India, where you have these populist authoritarian movements wedded to a religious nationalist movement that comes to power and then restructures the democracy and turns it into an illiberal democracy where the rule of law no longer pertains, where it's functionally a one-party state, and where there's violence on the margins that goes unchecked against religious and racial minorities.
comparing it to 1933 Germany, people are gonna, I know for a fact, be like, "Whoa, that's intense language," right? Yeah. And I'm curious for you. I always kind of go back and forth with the Hitler comparisons because on one hand, I'm like, I think Hitler, from what I understand, was very motivated from the beginning of his hatred towards immigrants, especially Jewish people. He always had that like foundational belief that the Jews were behind everything. Yeah. Trump doesn't strike me as someone who has that kind of like deep-seated belief of something like that. I think that he is, just to your point, power hungry, loves attention, and will promise anyone anything if they'll give him unwielding loyalty, right? And at the same time, I always cite the docuseries Hitler on Netflix. It really helps me understand how things like this can happen. Yes. Meaning how leaders who start out at the fringes and how they kind of take over more and more, how their propaganda is really effective, how they gain this cult of personality. And so I don't want to be the person who's like, oh, there's no comparison here to Germany or what Hitler did. But I also don't want to be someone who's like, this is it. Like, it's just a matter of time before like we're facing another Holocaust situation, Yeah. So for you, why do you feel like what you just said about 1933 Germany is really potentially on the table for you, given what you know?
If we, first of all, I think we get so fixated on Hitler.
Right.
Hitler wasn't the only fascist leader that we've seen. There's been a lot of fascist leaders, and fascism is not about ideology. It's about the will to power. It's about the one leader, the one charismatic leader who unites the country and who offers kind of this messianic solution to the country's ills. And the United States in 2024 is not Weimar Germany, right? And right. We are not this defeated, beleaguered. I mean, we're still the global superpower.
Right.
We still have the largest economy in the world. We still have the largest military in the world. And so I think that some of the particularities of the vulnerabilities that Hitler exploited are not there. But Mussolini was a fascist who was a lot less competent than Hitler. Still did decades of damage to Italian society. Still participated in the dehumanization of whole populations, right? And so I think we need to be just aware of this range of possibilities. And so I don't know that we would get to the Holocaust in the next 4 years. I think that would be a stretch. That's on the far end of the probability spectrum. But I truly think that whether directly or indirectly, hundreds of thousands of people are going to lose their lives because Donald Trump became president. Some of those will be in Ukraine. Some of those will be in Gaza. Some of those will be in Iran. Some of those will be at the U.S. border.
Right.
Some of those will be internal to the United States. Citizens of the United States who protest, African-American people who die at the hands of revanchist police forces. And I think we need to also keep in mind what authoritarian forces and movements often do when they come to power is they create a class of people who can commit violence with impunity. Sometimes that's military, often it's not. And the way we talk about those groups when they're not military is they're brown shirts. And how do you get brown shirts? Well, you take a group of people that's already inclined to and has perpetuated violence, and tell them it's okay to keep doing that.
So you pardon your Proud Boys,
you pardon the January 6th participants,
right?
Which is something he's promised to do,
right?
And then what do you say? What is it about those people? How do those people start thinking? They say, we are loyal to Trump. We are here to enforce Trump's priorities. And if we get into a spot of trouble,
right,
he'll pardon us.
Right.
And the Supreme Court, in its immunity decision, basically gave the executive branch unchecked power. It was the most anti-democratic Supreme Court decision maybe ever.
Wow.
And I don't want anyone having that power. I don't want Joe Biden having that power. I don't want Kamala Harris having that. I don't want Barack Obama having that power.
Right.
Because that is a power that will corrupt. And now it's been put in Donald Trump's hands. The worst person possible. And so we already know what he does when he has impunity. When there's space for him to exploit, he will do it. And I take very, 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 very seriously what John Kelly said right before the election. John Kelly was Donald Trump's longest serving chief of staff. He is a military veteran. He had no reason to come out and say what he did. It did not benefit or advance him at all. And he came forward and said, the man is a textbook fascist.
Yeah.
John Kelly saw Donald Trump making decisions up close on a daily basis.
Right.
He was the one executing those orders. He was the one who put together and enforced the child separation policy at the border. He is not some left-wing squish.
Right. Yeah, right. He's not some tree-hugging hippie, Yeah.
And he felt the need to come forward before this election to warn us and say the man's a fascist. I don't discount that. I trust people who've been in the room. I trust Stephanie Grisham, who was Melania Trump's chief of staff. In a recent documentary, she said, you always think with Donald Trump, there has to be a line that he won't cross.
Right.
There has to be something that he will not do. He will do it.
Right.
There is no line. There is no barrier for him.
And this man is given the theological justification primarily, yes, through Catholic voices, but primarily, in my opinion, through white evangelicalism, right? This world of your charismatics, your New Apostolic Reformation types, your Reformed Red Pill types like your Doug Wilsons, et cetera, and the Catholic as well, your trad Catholic entity. And it's just very difficult to watch, again, my own faith tradition be the one to look at him and be like, God's hands on him. Yes. God has anointed him. But talk to me about the symbolism there and what that does to a church. Because I think about I was always taught that the church is called to be the salt of the earth and it's called to be a shining city on a hill kind of vibe. And we're the hands and feet of Jesus. And I look at this and I'm like, I don't know if Jesus would be laying hands on Trump being like, this is my servant, well done. I don't see that happening. Yet we're looking at a church that is just all in and really in bed with right-wing media voices, your Charlie Kirks of the world. Dream City Church, a mega church in Arizona, hosted, after Trump got convicted, they hosted a big rally for him on the same stage that they worship a Jesus who said, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. Mm-hmm. They had a megalomaniac on the stage who vowed retribution for his enemies. Yes. Right? And I look at this and I go, wow, what Bible are we reading? What Jesus are we following? And I know that this is kind of your wheelhouse because you've been tracking so many of these key figures, giving the theological underpinning to create the justification for the average Christian in America to feel good about voting for this man. Where does Christian nationalism go from here? Do you see it being embedded in the Trump administration? We have things like the Seven Mountain Mandate, but then we have more theonomy or a theocracy type of, not theocracy, but theonomy ideals of your R.J. Rushdoony types, which is more Doug Wilson. There's a lot going on. Yes. Help us parse some of this out.
So I think first, we shouldn't be precious about Christianity. Christianity gave us the Crusades. Christianity has given us Christian imperialism. Christianity backstopped and justified colonialism. Christianity has been used in many ways to create modern racism. And so I think we need to not pretend that Christianity has some intrinsic quality to it that resists fascism.
And you're saying that as a Christian.
I am a Christian.
Right, me too.
I have a seminary degree.
I am Jesus people.
I go to church on a weekly basis.
Right,
I worship Jesus. Yes. I don't cross my fingers when I say the creeds.
Exactly. You're all in.
But Christianity is a human tradition.
Yeah.
Jesus was not walking around first century Galilee saying, I'm starting a tradition called Christianity that will be a global movement that will take over the world.
Right.
Jesus was a first century Jew who I think is incredible. And I follow him as my Lord and Savior.
Right.
But he was not, we built Christianity.
Right.
And it has humanity embedded in it, in humanity's beauty and humanity's decay.
Yeah.
And so, so we don't need. I get so frustrated when people look at Christian nationalism and say that's not Christian.
I knew it. The same. Me too.
It is absolutely Christian.
Right. Yes.
Yes, it is absolutely Christian.
Yes.
Christian is as Christian does.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. It's not Christ-like.
Right. I often say that while Christian nationalism is part of a Christian tradition, it is inherently antichrist in nature.
Yes, and I actually think that the Antichrist is a category we need to resurrect and use more.
Yeah,
right
I
now.
totally
It's a
agree.
biblical category, and I think it's a more useful one sometimes than heresy, because heresy was always a little bit of a toothless category because it was just about beliefs.
Right, you're always someone's heretic, right?
and it's this thing that we've thrown around for so much time that it's lost its power, it's lost its sting.
Especially in the Protestant tradition, right? We're all our own popes, and everyone's claiming authority. I mean, even the term evangelical, the National Association of Evangelicals, they have no power to enforce what if I call myself a new evangelical or not, right?
Yes.
So call me a heretic. I just don't give a shit.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot of power there, right?
Yeah.
I would agree.
So in terms of parsing out what's going on, I think we're, for the last decade, and this is what my book is partly about, we've been experiencing a tectonic shift.
Did you bring your book?
I did.
Where is it?
It's in my bag over there.
Yeah,
Here, let me grab
go grab it. I got to promote this book, obviously. That's why I'm here. Thank you. There it is. The Violent Take It by Force. The Christian movement that is threatening our democracy. It's out now, right?
It is. Yeah,
and
it came out
Kristen
October 1st.
Dumais is the biggest endorser. I love it. Okay, awesome. This is the book, friends.
We are experiencing this tectonic shift in the culture of American Christianity, in the culture of the religious right, in the culture of American evangelicalism. And it's when you're in the middle of that, it's very hard to describe the landscape, right? Because it's changing, it's shifting underneath your feet.
Right.
And part of that is Trump. Some of those forces were at work before Trump. Some of it is the just shift that we've had in media. Some of it is the shift that we've had in our politics. I would say right now, if we talk about Christian nationalism, I think it's helpful to imagine it as a pitchfork with three prongs.
Okay.
Or a three-headed dog, whichever is the more ominous of the metaphors. So one of those prongs is something I'm definitely not expert in, and that would be kind of these radical traditionalist Catholics, the kind of J.D. Vance crowd.
Harrison Butker.
Yep. Yeah. So and it's a
Candace Owens.
Sure, Candace Owens. Yes, it's a world that is in rebellion against Vatican II.
Right.
Vatican II is this very landmark set of reforms that occurred in the Roman Catholic Church in the 1960s. I started my Ph.D. at Georgetown University right as the 50th anniversary celebrations of Vatican II were going on. I came in as this evangelical background Protestant, like I've never heard of Vatican II, and here are all my professors quoting it chapter and verse the way I quote the Bible.
Yeah, and I bet most people watching are like, Vatican what? You know,
so so Vatican II was this massive reform in the life of the church, trying to bring the reason that Catholic services are in languages other than Latin today is because of Vatican II. The reason that the Catholic
when was
Church,
this? What time frame?
1960s.
Oh, like less than 100 years ago.
Yes, about 50 years ago, a little over 50.
Wow. Okay.
So 60 years ago, I guess now, and they were the reconciliation between Catholicism and Judaism comes out of Vatican II. The church's contemporary approach to interreligious dialogue and multi-religious societies, even the embrace of democracy by the Catholic Church, it was fledgling up until Vatican II and has been very robust since. And but these rad trad Catholics want to go back to the old Catholicism,
make Catholicism great again,
the monarchic Catholicism, and they're very much in rebellion against Pope Francis as well.
Right,
They would like a much more hardline Pope, and they're very willing to buck the current Pope when he does not align with their vision of Catholicism. So that's prong one, and that's the J.D. Vance world.
Okay. Who's now our vice president? We just need to be very clear. Well, I say that because sometimes people think that we're being extremists or that, like this is never going to happen. And I really like making sure people know how much power some of these groups have and how close they are to the White House. In this case, the vice president-elect of the United States very much tied into this trad Catholic movement.
Yes, and I would argue also parts of the Supreme Court have been hijacked, if not co-opted by this kind of radical traditionalist Catholic vision, and we should not discount the effect that has on our jurisprudence, on our legal system. The second prong, or the second head of the dog, would be these reformed Reconstructionist Theo bro types, the Doug Wilsons, the Stephen Wolfs, the William Wolfs. And that is a theological movement that really congealed in the 1960s and 1970s around R.J. Rushdoony and his son-in-law Gary North.
Theonomy, that
theonomy
term,
right. was a big phrase. Theonomy is just so Theo is God, obviously, and then nomos is law. So theonomy is the idea of applying biblical law to modern societies.
And we don't mean like the forgive the debts parts of the law, or like
no,
heal the sick, or like
times.
no. We're not talking about that. It's not that part. It's more of like stone the adulterer or stone the gay person. And by the way, that's not an exaggeration. R.J. Rushdoony advocated for stoning gay people in this new theonomy that he wanted to create. And a lot of the critique and assault on public education comes out of the R.J. Rushdoony theonomy world, which is where Doug Wilson comes into play, et cetera.
And Rushdoony is in many ways, I mean, he's not the only progenitor, but he is in many ways the godfather of the homeschool movement.
Yes.
And of the classical Christian academy movement.
Yes.
Both of those are coming out of these radical reformed strands of theology. And I would just note that Donald Trump's nominee that he just announced for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, these are the waters he swims in.
Yes.
These are the people he hangs out with.
Well, tell me about the tattoos he has on them.
So he has two tattoos. He has many tattoos.
Right, he does.
Nothing wrong with that, Tim.
Yeah. We're out of time, folks. We got to go.
But so he's a veteran. He served in Iraq and he served at Guantanamo Bay. He was one of the chief lobbyists trying to get this guy Eddie Gallagher, who committed war crimes and was adjudicated a war criminal, a U.S. veteran, get him reinstated and petition Donald Trump to pardon those war crimes and give him promotions. So no, he is a very aggressive figure. So on his chest he has what's called the Jerusalem cross, which was a symbol of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. And I'll get to that in just a sec. Okay. But he also has on his bicep a tattoo of the phrase Deus Vult. And so if you go back to the Crusades, in 1095, Pope Urban II gathers a group of church leaders at the Council of Clermont and proclaims, we need to take back the Holy Land from the godless infidels, the Muslims, the pagans, as he put it. And the legends of this speech, we have no idea what actually happened, but the legends of this speech say that the crowd of church leaders echoes back in unison, Deus Vult, Deus Vult, God wills it, God wills it. And this becomes the slogan of the Crusades, the violence perpetuated by the Crusaders. And it was not only against Muslims, it was on their way to the quote-unquote Holy Land, they would slaughter. They would have pogroms against local communities of Jews. And then when they get to Jerusalem in the First Crusade, after a couple years of this kind of pilgrimage, they lay siege to the city. And once they break through, they slaughter everyone in the city and then worship God. And then they establish the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem that lasted for less than a century of European Christian rule over Jerusalem, and until Saladin, the Muslim commander, takes it back, and then it's never held by the Crusaders again. But the Jerusalem cross that he has on his chest is the symbol of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. And both of these, the phrase Deus Vult, the Crusader cross, have both become symbols of far-right and white nationalist movements, these kind of neo-Crusader movements, really, that are appropriating the imagery and the idea of the Crusades, both to perpetuate Islamophobia, to say we are in a clash of civilizations against Islam and we need to drive Muslims out of our lands, to rebuild Christendom. This is another big thing for the Reconstructionist guys.
The new Christendom.
The new Christendom, right? Christendom is the domain, the physical territory that is ruled by Christian rulers. It is the physical lands under Christian hegemony. That is what the Reconstructionists want. That is their end state. And so Pete Hegseth is hanging out with these guys. He's got their tattoos. He's echoing their talking points. He even wrote a book in 2020 titled American Crusade.
Yep.
So
and he cited Doug Wilson as a huge influence.
Yes, and he's talked about Doug Wilson's influence on him, and so that is the second head of the beast.
Okay, I want the camera on me real quick. Come real close. Okay, Matt, get a real tight shot of this. That man that Matt just described was nominated by Trump to be the Secretary of Defense. I just want you to realize the kind of power that comes. I want you to realize the kind of power that someone like that has, who literally has Crusader iconography tattooed on him. And I know that when he was, I think that the story goes, Matt, that he was asked to, when he was, I think, still serving in some capacity, he was asked to, he wasn't allowed to like protect the inauguration of Biden or something like that because of his tattoos. They were seen as essentially hate speech, or hate symbols, I should say, something like that.
After January 6th, right, all these National Guard units get called up to protect Washington, D.C. I mean, this is where we had this imagery of National Guard troops sleeping in garages in D.C., right? His unit, because he was still in the National Guard, was called up, and there was a specific order given within the military hierarchy that said, if soldiers have these tattoos, I mean, you're talking 2 weeks after January 6th, right? Where Crusader crosses and the phrase Deus Vult was part of the iconography of the far-right crowds on January 6th. They said those people cannot serve on that day. And he has claimed that was persecution.
Yeah. Secretary of Defense. Keep that in mind. Okay.
And before we move on,
please,
the Secretary of Defense, the people in the first Trump administration who were the interface with the military, those were the heroes who saved us from Donald Trump's worst impulses. Those were the John Kellys and the Mark Milley types who stayed in there because they said, to put a man like that in uncontested control of our nuclear arsenal, we cannot have that happen.
Right.
We need people we trust who actually have the interests of the American people and have the Constitution in mind to be in that point of interface between Donald Trump and the military, because when the order comes down, you need someone with a conscience standing right there to say no.
And now
now it's Pete Hegseth.
Yeah, now we got Pete.
Is the one that
now
Donald
we got
Trump
Crusader
wants.
Pete in that position. So I just think it's really important. I know that for some people this might feel real doom and gloom. And certainly as we walk into 2025, we're going to be thinking about ways to strategize and mobilize and think about that better path forward. But before we do that, we have to understand why so many people, especially scholars, I mean, friends, I've interviewed so many people over the past year or so who do this stuff for a living, who look closely at the evidence. The reason why so many of my friends in the academic world are so worried is because of things like this. And I think it's important to know how deep the infection goes before we can prescribe the right antibiotic, to hopefully minimize the damage that's being done. Yeah, it's just important.
I'm not out to catastrophize. I'm not out to scare anyone beyond the amount they should be scared. And we should be scared right now.
Yeah.
And I think that's sobering and that's real. But that does not mean we give up. It does not mean we are apathetic or cynical about this. We need to resist it.
Yeah.
But resisting it is going to be hard.
Yeah.
And it's not, and I think we also need to be realistic about what we can accomplish in that resistance. We are moving into a space where I don't know that in 4 years we'll be able to call America a democracy. And if that's the reality, some of our voices are not going to matter in terms of just politics.
Yeah.
And so I think we need a moral protest.
Yeah.
We need a nonviolent protest movement. But the brilliance of the civil rights movement, the brilliance of Martin Luther King was not that he forsook violence. It was he learned how to use violence. He learned how to take the violence into the bodies of the movement to prick the conscience of the country. And I think some of us are going to experience violence. And that I think we need to get our heads and hearts around that.
Yeah. What's the third prong?
The third prong is my book. And that is the non-denominational charismatic space, often dominated by the New Apostolic Reformation in this kind of Trump interface, but it's a big world, and the NAR is just kind of one network within that. I argue in my book that they really were kind of the hinge on which this shift turned, but they're just one piece of that world now, and that whole ecosystem, the whole culture of independent charismatic Christianity in America has become so corrupted and warped and polluted around Donald Trump. I say that as somebody who grew up at least on the edges of that culture, and who I still think there's beauty.
Yeah.
And there's wonderful things within that culture. I am not an anti-charismatic at all.
Right.
I have friends who are charismatics and Pentecostals, and I value them. I am not denigrating their form of spirituality at all. But that the leadership culture in that independent charismatic space, and that's what my book is about, has become so corrupted and so warped around Donald Trump that if we're looking for an analogy, I fear that they are more like the German Christian movement that warped itself around Hitler, and the Catholic Church that warped itself around Hitler, than they are like anything like the confessing church that resisted. And so that is what worries me. And when you asked about how did this come about, how does this get sold? In the 2016 election, and this is a world that believes in prophecy, and that's where that is very, very important to understand, is they believe in modern prophecy. They believe that members of their community are prophets who hear directly from God. And so part of how this whole mythos of Donald Trump, this whole spiritual aura, this quasi-messianic, this dark messianic energy.
There have been books written called Donald Trump the Messiah.
Yes.
I mean, I have them in my bookshelf. Like, it's a real thing.
How that came about is the propagandists of the New Apostolic Reformation created that mythos through prophecy. And this started, I mean, the first of the conscious Trump prophecies that I have found was issued by a prophet named Jeremiah Johnson about a month after Donald Trump entered the race.
Wow.
And that prophecy, and it was the one that really, that Lance Wallnau, who I have a whole chapter on in my book, really picked up on and leveraged and popularized that prophecy. And this is how Donald Trump was sold to evangelicals in 2016. The prophecy was that Donald Trump is a parallel to the biblical figure of Cyrus.
Right.
And Cyrus was the emperor of the Persian Empire. If you remember your Hebrew Bible history,
I don't, but keep going.
The Jewish people, the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, after the northern kingdom has been destroyed and taken away by the Assyrian Empire, the southern kingdom is conquered by Babylon, the Babylonian Empire, and the Jewish leaders are taken away to exile in Babylon. Cyrus and the Persian Empire conquer the Babylonians, and it's Cyrus who sends the Jewish people back from exile in Babylon to go rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And so the idea is of comparing Trump to Cyrus is saying he's not a member of the people of God. Right. And he's not one of us, but God can use him. Right. He's an instrument in the hand of God. And the passage that gets invoked in these prophecies is Isaiah chapter 45. And in Isaiah 45, the prophet Isaiah is reflecting on this mystery that this heathen ruler, this heathen emperor could play such an important role in delivering the people of God. And in speaking about that and writing about that, using the voice of God, he says that Cyrus is God's anointed. And that word anointed in Hebrew is Mashiach. It's where we get the term Messiah. And I think that is the origin point for this messianic, I think we can call it a cult, in terms of a system of worship and emulation built around Donald Trump. And so that was how it was sold. He was sold in 2016 to evangelicals. It became a major rationalization. He's not a good Christian, but he's a Cyrus. Right before the 2024 election, after Harris enters the race, in that the few months where it's the campaign between Harris and Trump, a new image took hold. A new prophecy took hold that became the mainstream. It was not Cyrus anymore. It was Jehu. And this is a story that I think most people who, even students of the Bible, don't know.
Yeah.
Because it's obscure.
Yeah.
And Jehu is not the kind of figure that gets invoked in Sunday school.
Literally never heard the name.
So
I guess I'm a bad Christian. But.
So the backstory, right? This is before the exile. The kingdom of Israel is under the leadership of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, the two most kind of wicked rulers, the iconically wicked rulers of the Old Testament. And Jezebel has become, the name Jezebel has become a byword for charismatics. They'll talk about the spirit of Jezebel, and Jezebel and the spirit of Jezebel represents sexual immorality, LGBTQ identities,
aimed at
abortion,
women usually,
feminism. I mean, it's this kind of like misogynistic, negative space,
like catch-all for that.
And so charismatics since the 1980s at least have been saying the spirit of Jezebel is taking over the United States. And this is a way of them lamenting the sexual revolution, LGBTQ rights, all these sorts of things, abortion. So in the lead up to this election, this idea of Trump as Jehu took hold. And it comes from one particular messianic rabbi named Jonathan Cahn. But many of these prophets pick this up. And in the story, Ahab dies. King Ahab dies. And so Jehu is anointed as the new king. And Jezebel's still alive. And so Jehu, he oversees Jezebel's annihilation. Not just execution, but annihilation. She is in a high tower with her servants hiding out, and Jehu and his commanders ride up on their horses. And he commands her servants to throw her out of the tower, and they do. And her body hits the ground, and her blood spatters on their horses. And then they trample her with their horses. And then they go have a meal. And while they're having a meal, wild dogs come and eat Jezebel's body. And in the passage, this is 2 Kings 9, this is referenced as the fulfillment of a prophecy that the memory of Jezebel will be wiped off the earth and she will be reduced to dog feces. And this is the image that takes hold. And these leaders are not saying Donald Trump will vanquish the spirit of Jezebel. They're saying Kamala Harris is a type of Jezebel.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump is a type of Jehu. And we need to cast out Jezebel. Like it's an image of execution and annihilation. And then a few days before the election, Donald Trump gathered with his National Faith Advisory Board, his evangelical advisors, and Jonathan Cahn, this Messianic rabbi, was there, and he got up on stage. This is just days before the election, and issues this 3-minute prophecy over Trump. And he tells him, "You have been anointed as a type of Jehu, and you need to follow the template of Jehu. And Jehu came to the capital city to drain the swamp, and you need to drain the swamp."
He called you according to the template of Jehu, the warrior king. He called Jehu to make his nation great again. Jehu came to the capital city with an agenda to drain the swamp. Jehu forged an alliance with the religious conservatives of the land, so it was your destiny to do the same. To come to power, Jehu had to prevail against the nation's former first lady. So to come to power, you had to prevail against the nation's former First Lady. Jehu overturned the cult of Baal by which children were sacrificed. So God chose you to overturn America's cult of Baal, Roe versus Wade, by which millions of babies were sacrificed. And you set it in motion on a day that was appointed from ancient times to cause a nation to turn away from its sin.
What's he referring to? He's not just talking about the execution of Jezebel there. He's talking about 2 Kings 10, the next chapter. Because after this vicious story of eradicating Jezebel, Jehu goes on a killing spree. And he slaughters Ahab and Jezebel's family. He piles he piles their children's heads at the gates of the city. This is the image. It's one of the most ugly stories in the Bible. And this is what they put forward as the image of Trump. This is the template for you to follow. Not like, oh, you're kind of like Jehu. This is what you need to do. And when that's preached in your church, when that is propagated by your prophets, how is violence not accepted then?
Right.
And they are conditioning their followers to embrace Trump's violence, to say violence will be necessary for Trump to purge this nation. And they are conditioning Christians, evangelical Christians, to say when Trump is violent, it's biblical. No matter how immoral, no matter how much it might stir up compassion for his victims,
right,
it's righteous,
right,
and it's biblical. That's how it gets sold. That's how evangelical Christianity can embrace fascism.
Do you think that do you see a confessing type of church coming out of the next 4 years that unifies around, resistance to this kind of tyranny and authoritarianism? Do you think that we're going to see more of the church kind of just bend the knee to Trump and Trumpism? Obviously, when it comes to white evangelicalism, which is my culture predominantly, my background, it's no secret that 80% of white evangelicals, they vote for Trump. They have since the beginning. I know that like the numbers of who identifies as white evangelical has shrunk a little bit, but it's still there. And the world I come from is completely infatuated, right, with Trumpism. It's just normalized. You have more mainline progressive spaces, but even then, a lot of those churches, 60-40. I mean, a lot of the voting that's come out, white Protestants like still in the majority for Trump,
Yes.
So do you think about like the possibility of a confessing church coming out of this? I mean, obviously the black church has always been a confessing church, if that's the sense. Yeah. But when it comes to like the dominant churches that are in power and that have so much of the culture's ear and eyes on them, do you see a remnant coming out of those spaces saying, what have we done? We must resist? Or do you think we're just going to see it get swallowed up by this populist authoritarianism?
I think most people, even most Christians, will come around to Trump. I think that's the pattern. People like authoritarians, Tim. People do. It's hardwired into us to like authoritarians. We evolved over millennia in packs and herds and with alphas. And then we evolved for once human beings attained some level of consciousness, we evolved as tribal people who can gather around the chief or the shaman or the king and believe that person is anointed by God. And yeah, maybe they have many wives. Yeah, maybe they tax us brutally, but at least they protect us. So there are deep grooves in the human brain that gravitate towards authoritarians because we want safety, and many Americans, many human beings are willing to sacrifice freedom for safety. And Trump promises safety. He'll never deliver safety. I mean, that's the Faustian bargain of authoritarians, is they promise safety, but it's only safety on their terms. And so I think I don't expect most Christians to be courageous.
Yeah.
Because most humans aren't courageous in the face of authoritarianism. And I hope for a confessing church type movement. I think we need to not wax too nostalgic sometimes about the confessing church. The confessing church was messy. It was hard. And there were big personalities that clashed, and their negotiation of theology was very, very difficult because they were trying to construct theology on the fly to resist Hitler and fascism and these things that they recognized were also tied to their traditions.
Right.
I mean, Hitler, even like you think of it like a Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran.
Right.
And the Germans were using Luther's hatred of the Jews as part of their propaganda.
Right.
And they were not inaccurate in their portrayal of how Luther talked and thought about Jews. That really was part of Luther's thought at the end of his life. One of the darkest and ugliest parts of Luther is he got worse with time. And he was a very, very bitter and ugly old man by the end of his life. And his hatred of Jews, his hatred of Muslims, his hatred of his fellow Protestants, his hatred of Catholics was vicious. And so I think we need to be realistic and know that I don't think we need to get into hagiographies.
What's that?
These biographies of saints that only tell the good side of the story.
Cool.
I think we need to be realistic, but I do hope, and I think I take great comfort from the strength of the Black church tradition.
Yeah.
I think white Christians right now desperately need to be in a learning posture to the Black church. We need to be apprenticed to the Black church. It has been a resistance tradition forged out of great suffering and great pain, but that has had a capacity for human decency that I think white Christians really need to understand and learn from. And I think we need to learn from other Christian resistance movements around the world. The reality was the confessing church did not merely spring up in Germany. There were support networks of theologians and people speaking into that space from outside of Germany. And I think we need to have more of an international and transnational lens right now, because authoritarianism is on the rise not only in the United States, it's on the rise around the world. And I think we need to have more cross-pollination between these resistance movements, not just Christian resistance movements. We need to learn from Muslim resistance movements and Jewish resistance movements. We need to learn from Buddhist and Hindu resistance movements that are speaking authentically from within their tradition, but challenging the bastardization of their tradition. And I think we need to get creative. I mean, I really have found inspiration in the case of Tunisia after the Arab Spring, right? So you have the Arab Spring, and the dictator gets deposed, and there's an Islamist party, an Islamic nationalist party called Ennahda that is very strong in Tunisia. But then there's also the secularist coalition, and Ennahda is not the most extreme end of Islamism. It's a kind of more of a moderate Islamic nationalist movement. And the leaders of Ennahda forge a government of coalition with this secularist party. And they have to negotiate a constitution between ardent secularists and religious nationalists.
Wow.
But they both love the country, and they both and they managed to put together a coalition. And I think we need that, because
we do.
The reality is, if we think about the center left to the left, half of that is Christian and half of that is secular right now.
Well, yeah.
And right now there is great disdain between the secular parts of that coalition and the religious parts of that coalition.
And in the media, like left wing, not mainstream, left wing media, largely secular.
Yes.
So your Young Turks, your Hassan Pikers, as far as I know, like they're not really thinking about faith. And listen, that's fine. I'm not here to proselytize or to convince people.
Right.
But we have to start working together. And show that, I mean, for example, Andrew Seidel and I are really great friends. You know, he's an atheist, but he's on the show often. We talk often. Like we share the same values, right? And we have to find those wider coalitions, and that might include some compromise. It might include saying, it's not my cup of tea, but I get it. It's a bigger world. We can still work together. I just think that we're going to need to really think about a wide coalition of voices and people. The tricky part with that is when you have all those different voices and they're perspectives and their core values, sometimes you have like a 10-way tug of war a little bit. And it's hard to get all those people moving in the same direction. But we need to, because my thought is if we're going to resist whatever Trump and his loyalists are going to bring to the table, if we're not unified, at least around that, I talked to, I'm not going to name him because it was a private conversation, but I talked to a very conservative evangelical person who's a pretty well-known figurehead, been kind of kicked out by his hard right people, kind of now seen as like, he's the lightning rod for all of those people. And I said, hey man, I get that we have like real big, massive disagreements on a lot of issues, around maybe abortion and queer inclusion. But like, we got to figure out a way to work together so we have a democracy left to argue in.
Yes.
And he's like, I totally agree. Yes. And like, that's how wide we might have to go with this, to the point where we have a pretty big tent where some core issues are disputed. But my God, if we don't have a democracy that we can argue these things in, what is the freaking point?
And I say this as somebody who deeply respects people who are not religious.
Totally.
And respect their right to reject religion.
Of course.
If the propaganda is theological,
the
counter messaging has to be theological.
Yep.
And I think many of us, you and I think would both identify as ex-evangelicals, right?
Yeah.
We both came up with an evangelicalism. Yeah. I would not call myself an evangelical anymore by any definition of evangelical.
How about a new evangelical? Come on, the water's warm, I swear, Matt.
Define the term for me and maybe define new and maybe I'll get there. But we need voices that can speak theology and can speak Bible right now. 100%. And I know that for many of us, theology was weaponized in an abusive way. And so that vocabulary, that register, that grammar feels foreign and alienating and harmful. But theology also has to be part of the solution. And we need to have theological voices, and we need theologians to step up and be courageous in this moment and be confrontational, because so much of, especially in academia, theology is kind of like with boxing gloves. It's kind of it's play acting. It's kabuki theater.
You're sparring.
Yeah, I'm going to show you my big, but there's no teeth to it. We need some theology with teeth. We need some theology with sharp elbows. We need some theology that pushes back on this Christian supremacy and that does not brook the arguments and does not accept, they're quoting the Bible and so I need to shut up. We need some theology that can quote the Bible back at these people with integrity and intelligence. And I see a few people that are kind of dipping their toes in those waters. We need more. And we need to find our theological voices again, because if you're just cynical about theology, you can't counter them. You can't counter these Christian supremacists, because they'll quote the Bible night and day at you. And the Theo bros will pretend like they win every argument.
Totally.
And I think we need to find we need to find a liberative, inclusive theology that is rooted hard in the Bible.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, let's end on a happy note. Alex Jones's InfoWars got bought by The Onion, so that's some good news. So that's great news.
It's like that candle in the dark.
Yeah. As small as it may be, it matters to me. Like, suck it, Alex Jones. I'm all about it. So that might be somewhat of a happier note. Listen, I know this is it's a very intense discussion. Like, I totally get that, but we have to have the real talks. Like I don't want to coddle people. I don't want them to think that it's not as bad as it could be. It's only gotten worse over time. And now that Trump is back with this vengeance, all the more reason for Christians who believe in a theology of love, inclusivity, and justice to really have a spine and to really say absolutely not. And that means not just responding to the fire hose of what people in that world are saying. It also means putting money and infrastructure and time into building new networks, media structures, whatever, to amplify voices, right, that are trying to give a better way forward in their faith. We can't just look back and say, oh my God, how did we get here? We have to give people a better direction to follow as well. Has to be that both and. And, for a lot of people who are deconstructing, especially when they're new, I totally get the need to look back and make sense of what the hell just happened. I mean, a lot of my work to this day is looking back on how did we get here and trying to understand the historical moments that I never was taught as an evangelical, you know, books like The Bible Told Them So by J. Russell Hawkins, right? Books that just like, I had no clue that white evangelicals were the staunchest supporters of segregation in the 60s and 70s. But as we know that, we have to use that to build a better future. So we learn from the past to create a better future. And I think for these next 4 years, while of course we'll be talking about what's going on in the Trump administration and hopefully bringing some kind of prophetic voice to the injustices, we also have to give people a vision for how a world can look better than what they have now. I think that's really important.
And I'll just say this. So I left, I stopped calling myself an evangelical around 2010, 2011 for personal theological reasons. Sure. I didn't myself, and I've always hesitated to use the term deconstructing, just because I wasn't abused. I had a good family, a good evangelical family that still is evangelical. I went to churches that were full of loving people, oblivious, sometimes borderline racist, but like loving and generous people in general. And I understand, though, that many people have experienced abuse. Many people are going through psychological processes of distancing themselves from that upbringing, and I understand that is the impulse behind deconstructing. I'll just say it's time for some of us to start constructing.
Yeah.
And constructing different theology, constructing different ways of being Christian. And I'll add to your list of justice and inclusion and equality and harmony, resisting empire.
Yeah, 100%.
Because the early church provided us with remarkable resources for how to resist empire. The early church lived a colonized existence under Roman rule, which was one of the most brutal empires in world history in the way that they utilized violence. And I think we've gotten so comfortable and wrapped up in bourgeois theology that says, how do we speak to modern man? And how do we think through all these cerebral questions? And I think we need to get back to some of the visceral nature of the New Testament and really parts of the Old Testament as well that are challenging these conceptions of power, these regimes of power. Jesus brought a kingdom, but it was an upside-down kingdom. Yeah. It was a kingdom of service. It was a kingdom that subverted the order of Caesar, and we need to recapture that because there's a new Caesar on the scene, and he's not brooking any disagreement. And so if we are going to recapture the gospel that is against the gospel of Caesar, we need to do theology again.
No, I totally agree. I mean, when I started TNE, it was always out of how do I be a better Christian? And that led me into the deconstruction space. I myself renegotiated my faith. I deconstructed a bit. And there are a lot of people who they kind of get above ground from that basement of fundamentalism and they go, wow, I'm in a huge house. Get me the hell out of here. I cannot be in the presence of anything Christian. And we always respect that journey. Like there's no judgment from us. I totally get that. For me though, my life since the beginning. I've been radicalized by my tradition to be a Jesus follower. I still am a Jesus follower. So for me, being above ground, I go, oh my God, I'm in a huge house. There's so much to explore to construct a new theology, right? To find that better way forward. So for those listening or watching, if that's you, like that's what we're here to do. If you're not one of those people, you're of course still welcome here 100%, but our focus is to help people find a better path forward in their faith. It's one of our mantras that we say over and over again, because people don't want to leave Jesus. I mean, I felt like if my only option is Trump Christian nationalism or non-belief, I'm in a lot of trouble because they both seem, for me, untenable. I'm hooked on this upside down, the first shall be last, love your enemy, feed your neighbor, love your neighbor ethic of Jesus. And I still believe that ultimately all things will be reconciled through Christ somehow, whether it's a metaphor or reality, I don't know, but I believe it. And so I that shapes everything that I do. It shapes how this podcast exists. It shapes how you and I have met because of that work.
Yes.
So I agree, like now is the time for people like that to get a fire lit under their ass. And for those who have money, who have networks, to pool those resources together. Absolutely. Because God knows, like we are outfunded, we are outwatched, we are out listened to, outgunned, but we have a much better message. Yes. And we have a message full of credible people who have done the work, who have thought deeply about these things, who can give us a better constructive vision of what it might look like to be a follower of Jesus in 2024 America, even when much of our own tradition has gone astray in favor of Caesar.
And Tim, I know that a lot of your audience, like us, comes out of this evangelical background. So I'm going to say this direct to camera. If the only theology you have experienced is evangelical theology, you don't know Christianity. You don't know the breadth and depth of the tradition. And you don't know the resources that are out there. Because evangelical theology, I say this as somebody who grew up in that world and still loves parts of that world, is very, very shallow. So go and resource the deep parts of the tradition. Go and read Black theology. Go and read liberation theology. Go and read feminist and womanist and queer theology. Go and read Catholic theology. Go and read the mystics. Go and read the church fathers and the church mothers, because there is so much in the tradition that is not even accessed by the evangelicals who themselves didn't even learn this stuff in seminary. And we need to go and find the voices of resistance, because they've been there all along, and we need to recapture and rejuvenate them and bring them into our discourse and find inspiration for how to meet the moment.
Matt, I grew up in the evangelical church. I didn't know that the church calendar was a thing till like 5 years ago. Okay, so right. There's a church calendar? Like what? So I'm with you on that. Hey, the book is The Violent Take It by Force. It's right here. It's out now. The Christian Movement That Is Threatening Our Democracy by Matthew D. Taylor. Matt, I mean, we've talked a bunch. It's great to have you in studio. We have a lot of work to do, so thanks for making time. If folks want to follow you, where can they do that?
I am still on Twitter.
A brave man.
I just try not to read my mentions.
Yeah, good call.
So my Twitter handle is @TaylorMatthewD. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on Threads. I'm on Substack. And my workplace is the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, which is at icjs.org. We have a lot of free educational material and courses and programs that we provide. And we're trying to challenge anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and Christian nationalism and try to advocate for pluralism. And unfortunately, that's becoming more and more controversial. Yeah. So all the more important, I guess.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming in. It means a lot.
Thanks, Tim.
Another one down, baby. Nice job, dude. Crushed that. That was great.